All right. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Laura Sandino, and I am the um, communications person at the Chicago Center on Democracy. And today we have two incredible speakers, including Carlson from Washington University and Peter Forberg, who from Berkeley, who will be doing introductions. Um, so Peter, I can let you start off with intros.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As was said, my name is Peter Forberg. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley, and I study political technology and the politics of knowledge. But I'm just starting out in my PhD program, so I've got a long way to go. The real person that we are here to listen to today is Professor Taylor Carlson, who is an associate professor of political science the Weidenbaum Center Director of Survey Research at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the author of multiple books. We will be discussing Through the Grapevine today, socially transmitted information and distorted democracy, but is also the author of What Goes Without Saying, Navigating Political Discussion in America with Jamie E. Settle, which was the winner of the PaulNet Best Book Award in 2023, and Talking Politics, Political Discussion Networks, and the New American Electorate with Marissa Abrignano and Lisa Garcia Bedolla. She studies political communication and political psychology in American politics, and I'm so excited to talk with her today. So I will turn it over to Taylor, who will give us an overview of the book that we'll be discussing today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Peter. I want to say, first of all, that if I don't mention it later throughout our time together today, you all should check out Peter's research. It's been such a joy to kind of browse some of the things he's been working on. So I really hope that our conversation can kind of draw on some of his really great work as well. And the other thing I will say is that I apologize if there's any weird background noise. There's some construction going on, and I have a 2-month-old who refuses to sleep. So you might hear some crying in the background. I promise everyone is fine, probably except me. With that, I do have a couple of slides to kind of guide us. Am I able to share screen? Maybe not. If not, that's okay.
I can make you co-host.
Okay. Sorry about that. I should have given you a heads up. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Can we see that? Good. Okay. Great. So just to kind of orient us toward this book, when we think about where we learn about politics, there are lots of options out there today. So this slide is admittedly very old, and so you can imagine this screen just exploding if we think about all of the sources and all of the places people can learn about politics. And these are the types of things that typically come to mind. We typically think about the news. But what's interesting is that although we know a ton about the effects of media coverage, variation in media content across sources and outlets and modes and all of these different types of things, the reality is that a lot of people are actually tuning out of the news. So Ben Toff has some work pointing to this new idea of news avoidance in American politics in particular today. And we can also look to some survey data suggesting that at least as of 2018, 68% of Americans are worn out by the amount of news that's out there today, and less than 2% of web traffic goes to political and partisan news websites. Yet, there's other evidence suggesting that most Americans still seem to know roughly the big stories of the day. So there's kind of this question of how do people come to know what's going on in the world today if we are increasingly turning away from the news. We find it overwhelming, exhausting, all of these things. Well, one answer is that they're learning about it through other people. So whether these conversations are happening around the water cooler at work or the Thanksgiving dinner table or online social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter or X or whatever you feel like calling it these days, the reality is that a lot of people are learning about politics and what's going on in the world through these socially mediated channels. And so what I'm really interested in my research agenda more broadly is thinking about how information gets filtered through our social networks and how the content that was originally communicated by media can change as it shifts through our conversations. From those people who do pay attention to the news to the rest of us who might not pay as close of attention, how is that content different? And so in the book, these are images created with AI. Just to warn you all, I introduced this theory, which to some of you may look a lot like the two-step flow, and that is indeed very much what I am building on here. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you right up front here is not a novel contribution, but I'll try to highlight what is new here. So the idea here is that first, news outlets are going to communicate information to the public. From there, a subset of the electorate who's really interested in politics is going to consume that news. And I call this group the actively informed. You might also hear words like opinion leaders being used kind of in this place in the original two-step flow concept or construct. So the actively informed then go tell their friends about it. And so they share that information with other people in their social networks. And so this is very much the two-step flow. Information flows first from the media to opinion leaders or actively informed, and then on to everyone else. And I call that everyone else the casually informed. However, what's interesting is that all of the research on the two-step flow primarily overlooks, or at least doesn't dig very deeply into, the actual information that's flowing through these different checkpoints of the two-step flow. And so I argue that at this stage, when information flows from the actively to the casually informed, that information is going to become sparse, biased, less accurate, and mobilizing. And as a consequence, then, the casually informed are going to become more polarized. They're underinformed, polarized, and engaged. And this creates what I call distorted democracy. And so in the book, I kind of walk through each stage. I document each form of information distortion, showing that it becomes sparse, biased, less accurate, and mobilizing. And then I dig into each of these attitudinal or behavioral consequences. And so just to briefly talk about the methodology here, I primarily test this experimentally. In the book, I do also do a little bit of analysis of social media data from Twitter, but primarily I use experiments. This is partially because WashU IRB was not wild about me bugging people's homes to actually measure their real conversations. So what we do here instead is I conduct these experiments where I ask survey participants to read news articles and then basically write summaries of them for other people. And then that allows me to compare the text of the original information that they read to the information that they then produced. And that's how I can look at the distortion side. When I want to look at the consequences side, I'm going to conduct experiments on news samples where I randomly assigned some people to read the original news article, other people to get one of these socially generated summaries of the news article or no information at all, and then measure how much they learn, what their political preferences are, and their likelihood of engaging in politics. So through all of this, I'm going to zip through the findings in case you don't want to read the book. Basically, I do find evidence that socially transmitted information is sparse. Here, I'm just showing that the amount of information is dropping dramatically. Here, it's just number of words, but we can look at this more rigorously as well. We see a lot of information dropping. That's no surprise, right? We see that the socially transmitted information is biased, where Republicans are passing on more information that favors their party and Democrats are passing on more information that favors their party. Perhaps not too surprising, but we've documented that here, that even when we start with unbiased information that's balanced between the two parties, that information becomes biased through the social transmission. I also find that this type of information is less accurate, where 3.5% of messages contained at least one piece of false information. This is based on a team of research assistants hand fact-checking each message throughout all of these experiments. We can talk about whether 3.5% is a lot or a little. That's kind of a normative challenge in thinking about what the appropriate benchmark should be. And similarly, this information is mobilizing. Although the news articles did not contain any explicit references or calls to action, we find that 4.1% of messages did indeed contain a call for action, where people are passing on some information and they're saying, now go vote, or they're saying, now we need to go protest, we need to express our views to our legislators, whatever the case may be. So I provide some evidence that socially transmitted information is distorted from what they originally read, but the key question then is, does it matter? And to look at this, as I said, I conduct these experiments, randomly assigning people to different pieces of information. And I find that it does indeed, when we get socially transmitted information from co-partisans, it can increase beliefs in misinformation. In this case, this was a study about misinformation about fossil fuel emissions, where the y-axis here is showing the percent of participants who were misinformed. And when people are getting that information from a co-partisan, so someone from the same party, we're showing an increase in belief in misinformation. We also see an increase in people sorting their political views. They're having more extreme and partisan sorted policy preferences after exposure to information, again, from a co-partisan. We also see an increase in self-reported political engagement, such as donating. And I also show a couple other forms of engagement, although not with causal identification in the book, such as patrolling polling stations and some like more protest-oriented forms of political engagement as well. And so through all of this, I want to highlight that the way we talk about politics matters. So one finding that was not part of my original theoretical framework, but I happen to have data to speak to a very current issue through this research, is thinking about election integrity and support for democratic values. And I find small d democratic values. And I find here that the predicted probability of thinking that your vote was counted fairly in the 2020 election was significantly higher among people who relied primarily on media for their information compared to people who relied primarily on socially transmitted information. And this is regardless of party. So this is not just saying it's all Democrats versus all Republicans sorting here. We are seeing this effect across the parties, where relying on others for information is leading people to have or is associated with people having less confidence in their elections. And I think this also just speaks more broadly to my second book with Jamie Settle, What Goes Without Saying, where we think about the social context in which these political conversations are happening, and they can seriously damage our social relationships. And so thinking about both the informational costs and benefits of talking about politics and what that information environment looks like, and what it's also doing to not only the way we engage in politics, but how we engage in our social environments more broadly. So that's kind of the overview of the book. Hopefully I didn't go too fast or too slow there, but I'm really looking forward to talking more with Peter.
Thank you so much for that wonderful overview, Professor Carlson. I want to start with a few words about the book generally, but I'll keep it brief so that we have lots of time for questions. First, I would say this is just a terrifically researched book that does not shy away from difficult and pertinent questions, both about society and about the research itself. I'm struck by the number of times throughout the book where I go, that seems like a really difficult thing to measure. How are they going to measure that? And then, well, we've got another experiment that measures that, right? It is a book that is reflexive, that interrogates its own assumptions and really tries to dig down into the mechanisms of the transmission of political information. So at the high level, I think an important takeaway from this book is we can't just be talking about the news and what people are seeing in the news. We have to be talking about how people are talking about the news and transmitting this information when they talk about politics, when they talk about current events. And in this way, it cuts across some of the contemporary narratives regarding the boogeymen of mis and disinformation and you know, these disinformation campaigns coming from the top to the bottom, and says, let's look at what's going on the bottom. What are people doing? And this, as someone who studies QAnon, who studies social movements, was so important for me to be able to say, hey, look, we need to be talking about how people are conversing, how people are engaging with political information, not just what is being said on Fox News or MSNBC, though those are still important and lots of people are doing research on them. So it is not simply a book that is just about how social media has destroyed democracy, right? It is not that flavor of book. It is a book that really asks difficult questions about the fundamental processes by which we transmit information, and leaves open a lot more questions about, as Professor Carlson said, like how do we make sense of these numbers? What does this mean for democracy? Are there good things in these processes? Are they all bad? What can we glean from it? And that's the grounds for a lot more research and a lot more thinking about contemporary political events. Professor Taylor said at some point, if you don't want to read the book, but I highly recommend that you read the book to dig into some of those details. There are so many terrific moments in this meticulous research where you sit there and you think, wow, just this one little finding. I want to think about that. There's more here to think about. Luckily, there's a lot of articles out there that dig more deeply into some of the questions and the findings. So there's always more space to be digging into it. But if you read the book, you'll just encounter so many of these moments where you just sit there impressed and going, okay, I need to think about this one thing a little more deeply with and through this book. So with that, I just want to recommend this book and really congratulate Taylor on writing such an engaging and meticulous work. When it comes to questions, I will stay a little more high level than digging into these details. I invite everyone to pick up the book and dig into those details as well, and also to post questions. So I will try. I have a list of questions that could probably extend this meeting for 2 hours or so, but I will try to keep it brief. And we'll spend about the next, I think, 25 minutes, half an hour with some questions from me, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes open to questions from the audience. So feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll try to pick them up when we reach that time. And we can also invite people to unmute themselves and ask questions directly if you prefer. So with that, I'll start with some of my questions. One of the first ones is about this major theoretical term in the book, which is socially transmitted information, right? And this is not the more commonplace and provocative terms like misinformation or disinformation. Instead, the basic unit of analysis, the starting point in this book, is information. Just information. I was wondering, Taylor, if you could elaborate on the importance of starting with information and what we might lose when we think only in terms of mis or disinformation.
Thank you for all of that. And this is a great question and an important one. And I will also say that, not to tease too much of what goes into the sausage here, but the first draft of this manuscript, I just called it social information, which is more consistent with how the political discussion network literature would talk about this type of information that's exchanged between people. But through the review process, one of the reviewers thought that wasn't quite precise enough and could be referring to sort of other potential concepts from like evolutionary psychology and things like that. And so that reviewer suggested just being very turgid, I guess, and using socially transmitted information all the way through. So I did that find and replace throughout the manuscript. But so I do think that these terms matter. And so I'm glad you asked the question. So one reason, when I'm thinking about this question, one reason that I think it's not really fair to assume that misinformation, as you note, is the same as just thinking about information more broadly, is because our public attention and our scholarship has been focused a lot on misinformation in recent years. But there's also this long history of research on the problems of just information in other ways, right? So thinking about research on the lack of information. So what happens when people just don't have information, period, and what does that mean for being uninformed as opposed to misinformed? Thinking about biased information, right? There are how many papers on partisan media effects and things like that. And so there have been concerns about information over time. It has just sort of changed and sort of in response to what is in vogue, right? So are we thinking about partisan media because now we have cable news? Are we thinking about a lack of information because there are serious costs or barriers to entry to accessing information and things like that? And so I think that's important to think about, is that like right now misinformation is very in vogue, but it's not, certainly not the only problem when we're thinking about the importance of the importance of information on shaping our policy preferences and what we believe to be true about the world. So in this book, I think it's important to take that step back and think about information more broadly, because when I'm trying to trace this social process, if I were to focus only on misinformation, I'd be missing a lot, right? And importantly, I would be missing, I think, the possibility of sort of the positive spin on this, right? So if I went into this book trying to understand how people contribute to misinformation, that like from the get-go has a very negative connotation to it, and sort of a doom and gloom story. But opening it up a little bit to think about information allows us to see how our peers can actually fill in information gaps that we're not acquiring if we're avoiding the news or are otherwise not getting that information from other sources. So I think that's important as well, to allow for this flexibility in the analysis, to allow for these potential benefits of socially transmitted information, in addition to just thinking about sort of, as you said, the boogeyman of misinformation.
Yeah, and I was even recently reading an article, I think, from the Shorenstein Center's Mis/Disinformation review, in which they said, why aren't we calling it propaganda? Why aren't we calling it any of these other terms that we've used in the past? Why have we suddenly lashed onto this one term? And it really begs the question of, well, what do we mean by misinformation? And how can we draw a clean line between information and misinformation, and also recognize, as you point out, that there's a lot of good that comes from people sharing information with one another. It's not all the QAnon conspiracy theories. Yeah.
Right.
Another major theoretical term in the book is distorted democracy, which you differentiate from dysfunctional democracy and just regular old democracy. I'd like if you could just, briefly explain what is distorted democracy, and how does it, as a concept, challenge our normal approaches to studying democracy?
Yeah, thanks. So distorted democracy is a context in which a portion of the electorate is underinformed, meaning both uninformed and misinformed, polarized but engaged. And the idea here is that when people lack sufficient information and have extreme policy preferences, this is particularly problematic when they're also more likely to engage in politics. And so we could say, all right, you can believe whatever you want. You can believe all of these wrong things and have these extreme policy preferences. But if you're not engaging in the political system, does it really matter, right? If a tree falls in the woods, kind of question. But if it is the case that then this group of the electorate is also taking action, then we might be more concerned, or it might shift the way we're thinking about democratic functioning. And so I think that this trifecta, so to speak, of being underinformed, polarized, but engaged, can sort of distort our view of what a well-functioning democracy looks like. And I think thinking about how socially transmitted information is one component that can contribute to it. Now, it is certainly not the only thing that is going to contribute to any of these components, or even all three of them coming together, but it is, I think, one piece of the story that we haven't been thinking about as much, especially when there's been so much attention on trying to find every piece of fake news out there and trying to find all of these more salacious political rumors and things like that. We're not thinking about sort of the everyday distortions that happen in our conversations, as opposed to the kind of more newsy stories that pop up. And so I think what I'm trying to get at with the term distorted specifically is in distorted democracy is twofold. So first, I think the distortion refers quite literally to the distortions in the information environment that I talked about before. So that's kind of, more of a heuristic, to not an actual heuristic, but just kind of really just trying to describe how the information is changing. And and that is a key component to then the consequences. So then the second piece here that I'm trying to get at with the distortion is that our democracy might still function in that our institutions are still in place, elections are still happening. And so like even beyond all of these discussions happening now about democratic backsliding, or these formal checklists of what is actually required for us to be considered a democracy, thinking about the perceptions of the health of our democracy, and what that fundamentally looks like and what those criteria should be or are, I think might be shifting a little bit in response to some of these changes in the information environment and the actions of this underinformed, polarized, but engaged group of the electorate on both the left and the right. And so I think what's central here is thinking about this as distorted rather than dysfunctional, because it highlights that democracy can still function in spite of some of these changes that we might be sounding alarms about.
Yeah, and I think we see this a lot in mis and disinformation research, in which you have, things like QAnon or the Stop the Steal kind of campaign, in which people have fundamentally different distorted understandings of what's happening in the democratic process, but the process is still continuing on. So what are the implications of people thinking that the government is dysfunctional, is falling apart in all these ways? And it really does, it's a great term because it threads this line between, the reality of the institutions that we're engaging with and then the public perception of those institutions, which is so important. You tell the readers up front that this is not a book just about social media and misinformation and polarization. It's about a fundamental process by which we learn about the world through social interaction. To me, this framing gives the book a great deal of historical value, right? To think beyond context, just social media, but going back in time. I was wondering how we could use the concept of socially transmitted information historically to understand what might be unique or completely routine within our contemporary information environment. That is to say, how might we use socially transmitted information to understand what's changed within our politics and media?
Thank you. That's very kind and a really interesting question. So I think some of this I'm actually going to recommend some other work. So Tom Standage has a great book called The Writing on the Wall, which traces basically like different forms of social media over time, like going back before the Roman Empire and looking at, how changes in media technology or media environments have like how that these changes have occurred over time, but there's still something very human about like craving this social information and exchanging information socially, and sort of what are the evolutionary explanations for this, the psychological explanations for this, and basically trying to get at why is social media, the way we think about it today, so addicting. And he basically argues that this is not actually that new, it's just in a new form, and this form has changed a lot over time. And so I think about socially transmitted information within the context of my book in a similar way, where I think it's important to consider the fact that a lot of this is just human, I don't want to say human nature per se, but is driven by a lot of cognitive biases that we all share that drive us to want to communicate with one another, that lead us to want to consume information that is consistent with what we already believe to be true, and then share that information with others. And so some of this is not necessarily, intentional, but it's just kind of how we communicate. So whether that was happening around the water cooler in the 1950s, or whether it was happening over the phone or happening over letters, or now it's happening, I don't know, on TikTok or whatever the kids these days are using, right? Like whatever the new, the flavor of the week, form of communication is, we can see, I would imagine that we see a lot of these same patterns over time. And so I think that's useful for thinking about this as a lot of the importance of our social relationships in sort of structuring the way we think about politics being very similar over time. However, there have been changes, right? And I think that the key change here is thinking about how social media in an online environment can dramatically change the scale and speed at which we can connect and spread this information, right? So you could think about a salacious rumor, right, that was spread 30 years ago even. That rumor is going to spread much slower, right? If people have to like call each other, or even if it's a face-to-face context, like you have to actually be in the same physical space as someone who would want to have this conversation with you, who would spread this to someone else, right? It just takes longer, but now, it can reach millions of people in seconds, and that makes it that much harder to stay on top of, potentially increases the consequences of that. And so I think, like, even if our human tendencies have and cognitive biases have not changed all that much over time, the speed and the force with which it could matter and be consequential for our political preferences and beliefs could be amplified as part of this consequence of changes to technology.
Yeah, I always think about some conversations I had with participants in some of the research I've done on conspiracy theories, where a participant says, "I've been doing this since the '90s. Back then, I had to write postcards, right? Like would go through the phone book and I would send out postcards saying, 'Hey, have you heard about Armageddon?' And now you can just tweet." "Hey, have you heard about Armageddon?" And you can reach many more people that way. It's just, yeah, scale and speed is super important. I feel like I'm just going through a list of theoretical concepts, but I really want to talk about this next one, which is the two-step flow, which you discussed a little bit in your overview of the book. And just as a refresher for everyone, it's this idea of information coming from media to the actively informed, and then the actively informed passing this along to the casually informed, right? So this two-step flow of how political information is being transmitted in society. And you're critical of some of the normative aspects of this framework. It tends to see this flow, previous literature tends to see this flow as essentially good for democracy because information is being diffused across the population. And this is a good thing that people are learning in this way. And your book does have evidence that shows that people can learn through this information process. I was wondering if we could push this framework a little bit using your idea of socially transmitted information. And so the first way I want to talk about this is to try to close the loop on this flow. I'm thinking about contemporary media scandals. Like we currently have this ongoing one with Donald Trump and what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, and the fact that these kind of ground level rumors are now being brought up into, presidential debates and then being discussed by the media. So how do you think socially transmitted information, this information on the ground between people, flows back into the official media sources that are at the start of this two-step flow?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really interesting question. So first, a funny thing here is that the immigrants eating pets debacle that you reference here, I found out about via socially transmitted information. So I with a newborn at home, I'm not catching the debates these days. And my mom, who is graciously watching that newborn right now, told me, she was like, "Well, something's going on with the debates. I don't know exactly what happened, but I saw these pictures on Facebook of like pets in like burger baskets, and then I was at Girls Weekend, and we were really talking about it, right? So it was this like." I was like, this is exactly what's going on. Thank you for being my actively informed person. Or I'm 2 steps removed here. So it was kind of fun for me. So your example here hits close to home. And so I think your question though is really interesting. And I have not thought as much about closing the loop. And so I'm going to be speaking here a bit beyond what I have any data to support. So take all of this with a big healthy Midwestern grain of salt here. But I would say that I think it's important to think about the financial incentives that media outlets face today, right? And so if we think that news outlets thrive on clicks, right? They need to get eyes on their articles, and that's whether it's because of advertising revenue or whatever it may be. More eyes, more clicks is part of what media companies are after, and there's work documenting that can shape the types of content that they produce. And so if that's the case, I think, what better way to increase your probability of getting eyes on your page than writing about something that people are already talking about? And so instead of coming up with yet another article about the debate that most people probably don't care very much about, right? If people aren't that interested in politics, for example, they're turned off by partisan media, as some of Yana Krupnikov's work has shown. Why not just give the people what they want? And you already know they're talking about this rumor because it has been spread through socially transmitted information. And so then you write about it, and all of a sudden you've basically met the people where they are, given them what they want. And it's almost like, yeah. So that's something that I would think about, is sort of the market structure and how that might contribute to closing the loop, and like what are the financial incentives of that structure, what media companies choose to cover. And Emily Thorson has this really interesting new book coming out, looking at the impact of media coverage on belief, on media coverage of misinformation. So looking at like the basically news outlets are talking about misinformation at a rate that is far greater than the actual amount of misinformation that is circulating. And so thinking about like, what is the effect of basically media talking about misinformation and fake news on our beliefs in misinformation and things like that. And so I think that's really interesting to think about. And I think you also highlight, the role that politicians play in this process. And that's something that in the book I don't get into as much, but they certainly, you could imagine politicians being at sort of like the start of the chain there too, where they, the actively informed are getting information directly from politicians. But that's it. I could imagine an argument where the model looks a little bit different than when it's coming from media.
Yeah, no, and that's super interesting. I think the discussion of the audience base and the importance of cultivating this audience is so important in how we're thinking about why it is particular news sources are putting out the information they're putting out. Is they're highly aware of their audiences and what it is that their audiences want, and how to cultivate that audience and continue to reap the financial rewards of having an audience. And so it makes a lot of sense to say maybe money is part of the thing that's linking this two-step flow, and maybe the influence of these more sensational stories is part of it. A phrase that you used there when you were discussing your mother telling you about the immigrants' pet stories was I was the second in this chain. And so another extension that I'm thinking about with the two-step flow is with your findings, you're focusing a lot on kind of one step, one person removed from the media and information. So I'm curious how you think about the wide diffusion of this chain, that you then have socially transmitted information that is again going to the casually informed, who's now telling it to another casually informed. So do you have any expectations about the kind of broader diffusion of socially transmitted information?
Yeah, great question. So you've hit on one of the many, many, many limitations in the research design here, used in the book. So I will say that there has been work by other scholars in kind of more of a public health angle has done a similar experiment, not with text, but where they went out to 10 steps of the chain, and they find that fidelity, as they call it, so like accuracy, decreases with each step, and the amount of information also decreases. So you're getting less information that is also less accurate by the time you're at the 10th person in the chain. In my first experiment like this, I went out to 3 steps, and I found that, yes, I did find that there is more distortion at each stage, but the vast majority of the change is happening at that first step. And so because of that, for simplicity reasons, empirically, I focused the book on the distortion that's happening just at that first stage. So that was in part for simplicity, based on uncovering that most of the change is happening at that first sort of news to actively informed stage. But I think I would expect it to continue to increase. But what I think is potentially I don't want to say more interesting, but more complicated to think about is what happens when these chains overlap, right?
Mm.
So like if I tell you something and then you tell Laura something, I'm just looking at names on the screen here. That's like one chain. But if I also tell Laura something, then she has information coming from two potential sources, right? And so thinking about kind of the overlap of these sources, I think is empirically gnarly and also probably theoretically gnarly, but very interesting and important to think about and probably more realistic in thinking about that external validity. And I also think we haven't in my work I haven't accounted for dialogue, right? So in my case it's always information flowing only from actively to casually informed. I'm not allowing the casually informed person to talk back to that initial person, to ask questions, to push them, right? And I think that is something that we observe in the real world. And I think we have some really great computational tools now. My colleague Erin Rossiter has developed some really innovative chat software that is like making these types of interactive synchronous experiments really feasible for researchers. And she also has some really great text models that deal with dynamic speech. They actually account for dialogue that would be useful for evaluating these types of questions.
Yeah, I mean that's super fascinating, especially this point about the overlapping chains. I mean, I think this is a very common feature of social media too. Not to focus too much on social media, but you see on Twitter or on Facebook, there's one comment thread, and then someone else is entering in the comment thread, and you have and then it's the question of this in this broader network. We get into more of these questions about the actively informed and, well, does this person have more likes on Facebook and are people more likely to believe them because they have the most, I see how it becomes a spiral. There's just so many things that can be influencing this broader network. But it makes a lot of sense, your initial point that, most of the distortion is happening just at that very first level, the person who's most actively informed. And as you point out, likely the most partisan and engaged has the biggest incentive to change the information in some particular way that is then being distributed. So yeah, super, super fascinating. I have many questions in my own head and in my notes here queued up, but I'll just ask you a couple closing questions for us, and then move into any questions from the audience. I see we already have one in the chat. So again, anyone feel free to add questions into the chat, or if you would want to pose a question verbally, I think there's a raise your hand feature that you could use, and I'll invite you to speak. So with that, you take a very fair and level approach to kind of the normative questions latent to this book. It's both a good thing that people learn about the news from other people, and it is a bad thing in which there's a lot of distortion and all of these other features of sparse and biased going on and more mobilizing. Given the increased pressure on social media companies to moderate online content and mainstream media outlets to fact check politicians, what advice would you give to people who are more interested in these questions of mis/disinformation and want to combat it?
Yeah, this is a hard question. It's a
I'm
really
sorry, I know
one.
It is. I get it all the time too.
Yeah. Like, what should we do? I'm like, if I knew the answer to that, I would be on my own island somewhere. But no, but it's a really good question to think about. So one thing that I will say that I think my book is perhaps more unique to speaking to as opposed to okay. So there are lots of approaches out there now that we've tested, right? We know a lot about different, media literacy interventions and how those can work to fight misinformation. We know a little bit about how content moderation may or may not work. We know a little bit about all of these different misinformation correction interventions, right? And we're kind of playing whack-a-mole. But we know a little bit about what works and what doesn't. But one thing that I think we haven't looked at as much that I think my book does speak to, that it's a little bit different, is thinking about paying attention to sources beyond media, right? And so if we know that by some of my colleagues here at WashU, these media literacy interventions can be great for helping people to learn to differentiate fake news from real news, or at least based on headlines, and can reduce belief in misinformation Um, but if people aren't getting news from media, how are we training people to be cautious with information that they get via word of mouth or from other people online? And so I think what I would really like to see is more investigation into in a grant proposal once I called it conversation literacy, which is probably not quite the right phrase there. But thinking about how we can sort of give people skills to think about political conversations as a source of information, right? And so on the casually informed side, making sure that we're helping them to think about and scrutinize information they get from other people in the same way that we would expect them to scrutinize information from news sources. But on the actively informed side, I think it's important to tell people or remind people that they could be an information source for someone. So I think for many people who are actively informed, it when they share information with others, sometimes they think they're just shooting the breeze, right? And they don't realize the potential impact that they're having when they're talking with someone else about politics. They might not know that they're sort of their primary information source. And so thinking about that influence that they might have, and so thinking about how we can help sort of reorient our political conversations so that when we're sharing what we learn in the news, we're kind of taking a step back to say, okay, just to be clear, this is my opinion, right? Or like, telling people the source that they got their information from. I read an article from the New York Times, and this is what it said, and this is what I think about it, right? Trying to separate that fact from opinion as we're transmitting information. So these are some of the things that I would like to see more of that might not be all that useful for social media companies specifically. But that's something that I think we don't really know much of anything about, and I think could be really effective for sort of just making sure that we're taking a wider lens to think about the information environment than we have been currently.
Yeah, super fascinating, and yeah, a very different approach. I like the term conversation literacy. That resonates a lot with me. But yeah, we've got so much on media literacy. What about conversations? So we have a question from the audience from Jerry Ree, which says, I would expect educated listeners to be less susceptible to information distortion. And now it's moving up. Can you point at any prescriptions, habits, or heuristics that is promulgated by education, which serves as an antidote to socially transmitted information distortion? So I guess the relationship between, yes, education and being protected against distorted information.
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I've actually found mixed evidence of this in some of the work. So when I try to look at what are the correlates of actually doing the distortion, it's kind of funky. Where you might expect someone with higher levels of education to be more capable of transmitting information without bias, without misinformation, things like that. But with higher levels of education also can come greater political interest, stronger partisan attachments, and more incentives to change the story a little bit or be selective in the information that gets passed on. So it's been a little bit tricky, and I see a little bit of variation across topics and how partisan the original news article was in thinking about that. But on the recipient side, are sort of people with higher levels of education more likely to or do they have a different shield against the content? Not in this book, but in a different paper with a colleague, Nick Anspach, we find that education is actually less important than information literacy. So I think it's not just sort of of course, with higher levels of education comes more information literacy, but information literacy is actually something that we found that had sort of a greater impact on differentiating true from false headlines, at least, than education more broadly.
Yeah, that's there's even the example which I remember surprised me in the book of there were a couple pieces of information that the people who were more actively informed actually were more misinformed about.
Right.
that stood out to me. We had one person who wrote in just to say, this reminds me of the game of telephone. It sounds like a broken game of telephone, which you've hit the nail on the head there, Edward, because the experiments used in the book are called telephone games. We've got a longer comment that's just come in, so I'm just trying to skim it and see. Okay, I'll have to read that very quickly. I'm still curious about the relationship between this information distortion through social communication and polarization. In a historical context, TV and even newspaper has not been accessible to the masses, and most of the people can only learn about politics from their friends' conversation. Would that yield more distorted information chain? Isn't that democracy in action always a hearsay democracy? So I guess this is trying to historicize and say, what about places in which there is not a high level of access to this kind of the first step in the two-step chain, of this media where there's less access to that. I think that was your question, right, David? I'll read the rest of it, but maybe we start with that, Taylor.
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I have not looked at this historically over time, in part because there's not a lot of great survey data looking at where people get information over time when other people is included as a source. But what I have done is I have looked at world values survey data to look very coarsely across countries to see where this to see the prevalence of word of mouth communication across geographic contexts and political and sort of like electoral systems. Now, I'm not a comparativist, so this mostly got cut from the book. But you do see sort of like less reliance on word of mouth in places where information is more accessible. So places with greater access to internet, more developed media systems, things like that. And then you see more reliance on word of mouth in countries that are that have less developed media systems, lower access to the internet, things like that. So I think this is not exactly what you're getting at in your question, but I do think that this access matters in terms of how large the size of the casually informed population is within a different space and time context. So if we think that having a larger group of casually informed people would lead to like more distorted democracy, or sort of like maybe showing more of the dark sides of distorted democracy, then I think your intuition is, I think right, where this access to information is contributing to that. But it's something I don't know. I'm speculating here a bit, and I think finding the right data would be hard, but it would be super interesting to think about more rigorously, especially if we think about policy interventions designed at increasing access to information, right? So like, internet for all type policies and things like that.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think reading David's question, a part of this too, which I'll invite you to speak on, that I think is a really tricky question is okay. So if when people had less access to information, we would have had, or to this, to the media, we would have had more of this casually informed dissemination of information. So why is it now when people have more access to news media, are we seeing this huge spike in polarization?
Yeah, and so I mean, so the relationship between the internet and polarization is there's a lot of work on this, and the causal identification is really, really complicated here, of course. So I'm going to sidestep that part of the question a bit and leave that to other folks who have looked at that more explicitly. But because, of course, I think that there are a lot of competing trends right now. I also don't think that what I'm demonstrating in the book is necessarily describing, the world in 2022 or whenever my last data collection was, 23 maybe, right? As much as it is, this is a snapshot, but I think you could probably uncover similar patterns at other points in history. But I think to David's point and Peter's kind of elaboration on that, new theoretical work, I think, could try to think more rigorously about what that would look like. Like what are the conditions under which we would expect to see that proportion of the electorate changing? Because and I think it's important to think about, right, like it increase to access to the internet does increase your access to news, but it also increases your access to socially transmitted information via social media. So you'd almost want to look at like the sweet spot between like internet with lots of news, but no social media, to then like internet with news and social media, right? Looking at these two time periods. And I'm sure that there are some like clever designs that could be used, like Facebook outages or things like that, where you could try to use this like exogenous shock, or the experiments where they incentivize people to deactivate their Facebook or something like that. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that, I think Chris Bow's work addresses this to some extent, saying, is there potentially Chris Bow, who's at Duke University, computational social scientist, he focuses a bit more on this idea of like, are there specific processes of like anonymity that would contribute to, is there something specific about social media? And part of that going to the idea that perhaps we don't have these mediating effects of being in a heterogeneous kind of space. Instead, we're in these echo chambers or these filter bubbles, whereas even if we were all casually informed a long time ago, we might have had more exposure to real people, and it wasn't as easy to polarize, right? There's a lot going on there that would require a lot more in-depth kind of conversation, but just as a quick answer, and that polarization is not entirely a new historical trend. Matthew Genskow has done some historical work. I think he's at Stanford, showing, we've seen polarization in the past, and that's linked largely to social conditions as well, not just the media environment. We have a question from Jerry again, which is, do you see what you're doing as moral education?
I'm gonna say no. And I guess if you want to unmute and explain a little bit more about what you mean by moral education, I'm happy to, or else I can just take what I think you mean. No.
Too
Okay,
long.
got it. All right. Well, conversation for another day then. But I mean, I think I will say, and maybe this isn't what you're getting at here, but I will say that, I don't view my job as telling people what to do or what to believe or anything like that. And I think, whether to talk about politics, not talk about politics, what news to consume, I think that's very much an individual and a personal choice. But I think that what my book does, I think, is highlight some of the empirically and in an objective fashion, try to highlight some of the things that we should be thinking about when we consider the information environment, and how our conversations or how our information sources could be impacting our preferences. So sort of like, here is the information and the analysis. Now you do what you want with it, right? So choose to find a new information source or don't, and then sort of thinking about what that means for democracy in general, I think is very much up to the reader, and up to any individual voter or non-voter. I don't know if that's at all what you were getting at, but very revealing. I don't know if that's good or bad.
I will leave us then with, I know we're at time, but I want to ask you one last question, which is, this is a big book with lots of information in it. You've done a great deal of work here, and it's evident by the hand coding of some of this information, the number of experiments. But with all of this done and published, what's the big question that's on your mind now? What's the thing that you're thinking about?
When will I sleep again? No, so I think I'm really actually chewing on the kind of intersection between trust in government and political conversations about local issues and local politics. And so I have a lot of work to kind of unpack the theory more, but that's something I'm really interested in, is kind of how conversations about politics, about local issues can contribute to polarization in kind of a sneaky way and dilute trust in political institutions. So that's something I'm thinking a lot about. And I also have a lot of great work with, not great work. I have a lot of work with great colleagues that I'm really excited about, like some work with Aaron Rossiter and Carly Wayne. We have this amazing experiment in the field right now where we are actually looking at the effects of conversations on attitudes toward political violence within real social networks, which is a really cool methodological intervention we're really excited about. Yeah, so I have amazing colleagues that I'm thrilled to be able to work with and collaborate with, that I am excited to return to those projects when I get back from parental leave.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. Everyone should check out the book Through the Grapevine and dig into all the details. And thank you all for joining us. Yeah, take care.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Peter, for these amazing questions. And thank you, Laura, for organizing. Great questions, David and Jerry as well. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Thank you for the center.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.